Yep.
And yeah, thanks for bearing with us. We tried to start this up a moment ago and had a technical issue. So now we're up and going, and it's great to be joined by you guys today. I'm glad we can have a chance to have this conversation. And so the tentative title of this conversation is Porn versus Art. And I think that raises a lot of questions right there. So there's a lot of room for exploration within that framework. But perhaps first, I think people who are watching will know Jodi and Jenny. But if you want to do an intro for yourselves, please do. But this will be the first time that they're meeting Emilia. So perhaps we'll put Emilia on the spot first. And you want to say a little bit about your background so people can get acquainted with you?
Sure. I'm a musician and I've been releasing albums pretty frantically since the early 2000s. Most recently, this month, I have an album that I just released called I'm Really Sorry You're Going Through This. And an old friend of Jodi. I feel like that's my real claim to fame.
Excellent. Where can people find your music, Emilia?
Nehedar.com. That's Nehedar.com.
Is that the name under which you produce your music, or is it
Yeah.
under? Okay. Great. Awesome. Well, if you want to send me any links, I can put them under this after we wrap up the live.
Thanks.
Awesome. Well, Jodi and Jenny, you want to say anything in intro or talk about anything you've got going on right now that people might want to check out?
Well, for me, it's just my Substack as usual, which is Saving Culture from Itself. It's just my name, Jenny E. Holland. Substack, and I write quite a bit at Spiked, which is a UK kind of dissident left online magazine. And Jodi?
Hello, I'm Jodi Shaw. I'm suing Smith College.
You!
Unfortunately, it's not something to be happy about. But and I have just, what else can I say about myself? I also have a Substack, and I just started doing speaking engagements, which I like.
And you're also a musician.
Yeah, I'm a musician. I should say that first. I'm a musician. Yeah, so the next so I'm working on music, and the next speaking gig I have coming up, I think, is going to be in Boston, but I'm not sure where, either BU or I think Boston University. It's co-hosted by Dartmouth. And then another one in the spring at Villanova. So I'm very excited. Hopefully I can catch people at one of those gigs.
Excellent. Well, with the artistic and creative tendency here in this space, it's a good place to talk about art versus pornography. And I think that that's something I've been increasingly concerned about. Pornography, the impacts that it's having culturally, the impacts it's having on personal relationships, on young boys, on men, and on women, for lots of different reasons. And I don't want to give a lot of caveats about heteronormativity. You can supply your own caveats. There's issues that are across the board, regardless of orientation, gender, et cetera. But the force that pornography occupies right now in our culture is certainly a big one, and it's very controversial. And as we talk about what's concerning about porn, and here I'm starting from, this is my standpoint, so you might take a completely different perspective on this and be more or less concerned about porn than I am. I know we're all mothers of boys and young boys at that. So perhaps there's something in your own experience as you think of your son coming of age. What do you think about porn? Are you concerned about this? How do you talk to him about this? And then how do you distinguish what is pornography and what is erotica, what is beautiful? And so I don't have a real specific question to launch on, but what are some of your musings on that? And maybe starting from the standpoint of, as a mother of a son, what do you think about porn in the culture?
Well, I'm concerned about porn. I think I'm not concerned about porn in and of itself. I'm concerned about it being used in a way to desensitize men from or boys from being able to experience a connection with a live human being. That's what I'm concerned about. So it's the use, it's the kind of the way it is used, not necessarily porn in and of itself. That being said, as a larger cultural phenomenon, I can't help but think there is I want to say coordinated. I mean, there's an attack in general on our ability to connect with each other. I firmly believe that. And I firmly believe that our power as human beings comes from our relationships. Like if you're alone in the forest and everything else has been taken away from you, if you have people around you, you still have some power. Like even if you have nothing else. So our ability to connect with each other really is everything. That is our power source. And it is the power source, I think, of any population or culture. And if that is destroyed, then I think we have nothing. We are very easily manipulatable and influenced, and any number of things can happen to us. So I know I went very far with that, but I see that the heavy use of porn and this big trend of young men who cannot have sex. Like they literally cannot get it up with another human being. And it's because of an addiction to porn. So that's what I think. It's a problem. And I don't know what the solution is other than education and talking to your boys. And it scares me because they all have phones. So that being said, there's another side to there's all, porn in of itself. I don't know. It's kind of like heroin or the opium, like in and of itself. It's not the plant itself, it's the use of it, the way you use it that could be a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I share the same concerns, and in the fairly limited conversations I've had with my son about it, I've taken kind of an old-fashioned, very blunt tack, which is just don't use it, which is probably not, or just don't look at it, just don't engage with it, which is probably not particularly realistic, but I think it's better to start from that stark position. I think if we were still living in the era of Playboy magazines and nudie mags and, magazines that were covered in paper bag, brown paper to cover the boobs and whatever, I don't think I even would have felt it necessary to have that super cringy conversation. But I personally feel that porn is like almost like a psychological weapon at this point, and it has no bearing on. I mean, I suppose you can make an argument that the sole purpose of it is to get off, but the actual, if you take it in totality, it's not about getting off. It's about, I think, kind of what you're saying, Jodi, which is sort of breaking down human connection. And I think maybe it's the video. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I suspect it's something to do with the video aspect of it as opposed to a still image is quite addictive. And I've read in places, just in magazines, nothing deep, like it kind of reassembles your brain and the connections, and actually does act like an actual drug. So I don't check my son's browser. I don't do any of that. I have said to him, and my husband, his stepfather, has said, just avoid entirely, and who knows what the actual outcome of that is. But I personally feel like it's a pretty dark industry overall, even though I'm sure many people use it in very kind of missionary, ordinary ways. And that's fine.
I don't personally see like this for my son yet. He's so young. I mean, maybe I'm naive. He's 9. He just turned 9. So I'm thinking about myself and like growing up with my ridiculous parents who had no boundaries, and that I was exposed very young to pretty extreme stuff. And I think that the thing that people are concerned about is the sort of escalation. So you can't,
Yeah.
you might start out with like, ooh, they're kissing, that's exciting.
Yeah.
But like before long, you need all sorts of crazy stuff to make it interesting, and it just escalates. And here I am, I'm 42, and I started off with, you know, I basically inherited my dad's kink, which is like a hard thing to deal with. But it is what it is. It doesn't define me. I'm very sensitive about the desensitization aspect of it, because it's dehumanizing and it's not erotic. It's compulsive. And so, you know, understanding that, it's, you know, if I think about how I'm going to talk to my son, I talk to him about advertising a lot, you know, like, what is, you know, do you notice that this advertisement is trying to take advantage of you, is manipulating your feelings? And I hope that when conversations about pornography, you know, come up, or when it's time to have that I can intellectualize it with him, and just talk to him about how this is not, I mean, it's not real, and it's it can explain these things. Like, it can make it hard for you to connect with a real girl. Like, a real girl probably won't want to be treated in any way like what you're seeing. But there's one other thing that I feel like I want to say, which is a little bit left field, which is that nobody ever talks about, like, vibrators. I think vibrators do the same thing for women. That
Talk about it. You and I talk about it. Vibrators, yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to.
So yeah, I haven't gotten to talking about it with my son yet, and I'm so, like, you know, it's like all packed up with that, like, he's growing up sadness. But I'm just not the kind of person that's gonna say, I think I'm not the kind of person that's gonna say don't, because that just seems like, well, I don't know. I haven't thought about it at all. But I would just want him to be able to wrap his head around it from the onset, and not, like me, just be thrown into sensory overload with no help.
You know,
That's-
on your point about vibrators, I think that there's a porn, I guess she's a porn expert, a psychologist who talks about this a lot, named Dr. Trish Lee. And she has a great podcast called Porn Brain Rewire. And she does a lot of psychoeducation around the process of pornography use and how it actually impacts the brain. And one of the things she points out is that when you are climaxing, when you're experiencing orgasm, the bonding hormones that are secreted are so powerful and so intense that you bond to the thing that you're using. And if you're using voyeurism as your vehicle for sexual satisfaction, then you bond to the act of voyeurism. You bond to the degree that you are participating in this act. So I could see how that could make sense with a sex toy as well. You're no longer able to be stimulated the same way by vanilla, you know, just a partner, another person. And so if it's paraphilias, or if it's other kinds of stimulus, then I could see how it would make sense that you'd kind of hijack and rewire your own stimulation process.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
kind of scary.
I can see how, like, well, even fantasy then. What about even just fantasy? You're alone in your room, you're gonna rub one out, and you got nothing. There's no screen, there's no vibrator, it's just you and your hand.
Well, yeah, I think that fantasy can
thinking.
also interfere.
Like, you have fantasies about, like, a certain person or a certain scenario, and you just keep, you think that can interfere. I mean, look, anything can rewire your brain. You can rewire your brain to anything. So that's how the brain works. It's trying to be efficient. So it's like, okay, we're doing this now. I'm gonna, like, download this into my subconscious and get super attached to it, so I can just run it without any effort, and it's just gonna keep running. That's a habit, right? And then it's an addiction. So
I think the direction we're going in is that the Catholic Church was right. Masturbation and looking at pictures of naked women is evil and bad, and
But
you should do it.
yeah, my point about the vibrators is literally that you're becoming physically desensitized to to touch. A man can't reproduce that. Like vibrators are not human.
Yeah.
And so if that's like if you're like, a good girl and you don't whatever, have sex with a man until it's totally safe and appropriate, and you're using a vibrator, by the time you get with a man, he might not be able to do it because you've been numbing yourself. I mean, I keep saying I'm just not.
That makes sense. I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think that some of these things are like extraordinary stimuli. So, when you're talking about fantasy, yes, I think there's a spectrum, right? Anything can create some kind of an interference. But when you get to the point of, say, internet pornography, and I don't remember who was making the point about video and how that has this really powerful effect. But when you talk about this, it's like an apple versus a starburst. It's flooding your senses with something that is like it. And for men whose sexuality, when it comes online, is really powerful, and women's is too, but men get really hijacked by their own sexuality as young adolescents. And to imagine that you could put this in front of them and just say, don't use it. I'm not picking on you, Jenny, because I haven't had that conversation with my sons yet. I don't know how to address this, but I think that it's something that I hear over and over from men. They wish they could stop using it, or they wish they had never found it.
Yeah. Well, they've all found it. I mean, I don't know. I tend to be kind of naive as well, and I don't want to get talking about my son, but like, I don't think he does look at it, whatever, but there's absolutely no way. In fact, I know that he has been shown things, and there's just no way that this isn't something that he has come across, even if he hasn't sought it out. And I agree that a sort of blanket do not do it, just say no, is deeply imperfect. I completely agree with that. But I don't know what the alternative is. I don't think you can negotiate with it, because just like you said, and other people have said, and actually, I mean, I have seen like these sites, and like, you're like right on the homepage, like there's some real weird, dark stuff. So, I can see how, even just out of curiosity, a 13-year-old or a 10-year-old or 11-year-old be like, wait, what is that? Like a granny? And then they click on it, and you end up in some really dark places. It's very obvious just from looking at even the homepage, right? And I think, Emilia, you said something so important, which is the sense of like, you didn't grow up with boundaries. And to me, everything to do with sexuality, in every facet of it, every manifestation of it, is solely down to boundaries. I think focusing on what the boundaries are is the only way to navigate through these really weird, stormy waters that we're in, because that like, and so I'm trying in kind of, I admit it, in kind of like a hatchet job way, to enforce, or to sort of pass on these boundaries to my son, and say, just don't start, don't get involved, don't look at, just don't. I also did say, I think I said, it was a while ago now, but I think I did say to him something along the lines of, and I think I got this from maybe like Whose Body Is It, or it was Isabella Malvin, who has a YouTube channel, and she's got a great Instagram page, and she's a coach, and she does a lot of work on the trans thing. And she's had some incredible interviews about porn, including trans widows whose husbands literally became trans after watching cis-heteronormative porn and all this stuff. And she talks about the abuse. She's had guests on talking about the abuse. These women who are participating in this, yes, it's voluntary, but essentially they're being abused. And that's one thing I did say to my son. I thought that was probably the most effective kind of antidote, because I think that would have been like, oh, in his mind, like, oh, gross, I don't want to see someone get hurt. It was like, even if they are acting as if that they're not hurt, they are actually being hurt. And I don't know, I don't even know if that registered with him. I have no idea, it was a while ago. But the boundaries thing to me is key. And I think what happened in the liberal world post 1968, post pill, post sexual revolution is that some very unwise, but I think probably well meaning people, and also there's a lot of non well meaning people in the background, but a lot of people thought, hey, whoa, boundaries are bad, and like norms are oppressive, and I think that was working okay until maybe 10 years ago. I guess you could argue when it all kind of went tits up, but it's not working okay anymore. And we need to bring back these values, and we need to close our minds a little bit, and kind of go back to norms, because I think the harms being done by two young people, children, but also young people, people in their 20s, is really I struggle to comprehend how we can possibly overcome this and undo the damage that has been done to a generation of kids who were essentially raised on porn and all sorts of other behavioral things that I have problems with. But I don't know how, like, the sexual damage that we've allowed to be done to our kids in the name of a loosening of norms, in a name of loosening of boundaries, in a name of freedom. That, I don't know, that was a mistake.
You know what's really interesting is that like when I say that I saw my dad's stuff when I was very young, and that affected me and imprinted on me. My dad had been very abused.
Yeah.
And so he was going, he had been in a Catholic military boarding school that he told me the name of it, and I tried to Google it, and Google's like, you want to know about the class action lawsuit? Terrible, horrible abuse from religious figures, like just so awful. He wouldn't talk about it, but I get it. And so that's what he was working with. And then he passed that on to me, and it's not my stuff, but now it is. And so it just seems like, when we get into these taboos, they are taboos. They are coming from somewhere. And like when you see, like, even if you, with Deep Throat, which took over the country, like, this was abuse. We now know that a person was abused, their images were disseminated, pardon the pun, and and we're all now having to deal with it. It's almost like it just feels, there's a sense of it that feels to me that if we have to deal with abuse, and then people will be able to wrap their heads around these taboos instead of just like fixating on it. Like,
and that kind of brings in the idea of shame also. I think there's a lot of shame involved in early pornography exposure, because you're not ready to see the world that way at that point. You're not ready to see that kind of really explicit hardcore. I mean, you made the point, Emilia, of going from kissing to what's next. And so if you're moving through relationships and ideas about sexuality in a natural and more natural way, then you're going to be exposed to the ideas of sexuality more gradually. But if you get it all in one heaping dose, then it can really warp your perception of the people around you and your thoughts about sexuality and your thoughts about yourself. And are you dirty because you're thinking these things? And so you can really spiral into yourself. I know someone really well who is a man about same age as me, who had a early exposure around 10, 11 to a bunch of magazines at his friend's house. His friend's dad had. It was a bunch of European hardcore pornography, a bunch of kind of kink stuff, including some stuff that then later on populated this man's own fetish. That became such a gripping fetish that it destroyed 2 relationships. And he could never be open about it with his partners because he was ashamed to bring it into the relationship. So he was seeking sex workers outside the relationships in order to explore the fetish. And the pornography use just intensified and intensified until he would go through cycles of trying to white knuckle through it and not do it. And then it would break through again to where he's using pornography again. And then it would escalate again to strippers and then to sex workers. And so it was this whole cycle for him as he was gripped by this early exposure to some kind of kink. And again, the shame was what kept him from ever bringing it into the relationships that he was in.
Do you think that if he had brought it into his relationships, and assuming he'd found a partner that he was compatible with, right, that was like open to it and they both enjoyed it, that would be a healthy like now he's okay, like he has an outlet, like he has a
It's possible, but I think for him also part of it was needing new partners. So it would have to be, in order for him to really be able to bring that fetish into a relationship, it would be, you have to explore this with me, and you also have to be okay with me exploring this outside of the relationship.
Well, that sounds familiar.
swingers. Yeah. I mean, I heard something you said, like, and the just say no thing, you know, like that kind of like imperfect, because how else do you can't negotiate with it. It reminds me of the just say no stuff, like with drug stuff, because yeah, like just telling, I remember being on the same page as my son's father on this, just telling your kids all drugs are bad. Drugs are bad. Do not do drugs. Do not touch drugs. Then when they encounter a drug, let's say the first one they encounter is alcohol or marijuana, and they use it, let's say they smoke some pot and they're like, oh, that felt good, like, not, you know, whatever. And then let's say they just, the next drug they encounter is, I don't know, fentanyl, like just by chance. And they're like, oh, well, you know, mom said not to do drugs are bad, not to do them, but I did marijuana and nothing happened and it was great. So yeah, I'm going to try this other drug too. Like, I think that just saying no, a blanket thing, can be very dangerous in that way. So maybe, you know, with the drug thing, like talking about drugs more, like there are different kinds of drugs. Like some of them are going to kill you or could kill you, like the first time you do it. Others are different. There's mind expanding drugs, there's mind closing drugs, there's drugs to numb, there's drugs to enliven, there's, and like and you need to test your drugs. Like I don't know, like I'm grappling with this right now, but it seems like the same kind of template, maybe, where, you know, they're going to encounter all different kinds of porn, from what Jenny said, like very missionary stuff to like kinds of like crazy stuff. Like, and they're very young and their friends are going to be passing it around. Like maybe if they know, hey, I know you're going to encounter this, like this kind could rewire your brain so that you are never able to have a sexual encounter with another human being. This other stuff, I mean, that's like, it's very unfortunate that we're in this position that we have to talk about this stuff with our children, in order to help and protect them. Like it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. But I'm wondering if there may be more talk about sexuality in general. Like I'm not really clear that that was ever a thing. Like I don't, like more, and not necessarily like this is where the penis goes and then this happens and then there's a baby. Like I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the feelings. I'm talking about the stuff, the brain stuff, because and then the boundary stuff. Like it's not just about your body, like, oh, I don't want you touching me here. It's about protecting your brain too. Like I don't think I want that stuff in my brain because it will change me and it's not good for me. It's just like with the drugs, like yeah, it's doing bad stuff to your body, but it's also doing things in your brain. And so maybe a conversation about the neurological or the synapse impact of what you put in your brain. Maybe that's the template, like everything, porn, drugs, like what kind of, like, and then the positive stuff too, like you want to put good things in your brain, right? Like not just like don't put these things in your brain, it's going to make you feel bad, but here are some good things you can put in your brain. Like what are some things you want in your brain? Who do you want to be? And
you're talking about moral hygiene.
Well, I don't know if it's moral. I think it's
spiritual, mental hygiene.
Well,
yeah, maybe. It's just
I have a lot of experience with that also because my parents, with their no boundaries, let us watch any movies. And so I learned from Scarface that cocaine is bad. And I learned from I Love You, Alice B. Toklas, that weed is fine. I learned from Hair that acid's pretty cool. I learned from Lady Sings the Blues that heroin is very bad. And like so it wasn't actually conversations, but because I was just exposed to this. And so this kind of brings back the art piece, like how can art be a intermediary almost? And I and so I don't know if you guys remember, like in the early 2000s, there was a bunch of films that came out that were like, these are films with real sex. And
Yeah.
I was in one of them. I was in Short Bus, which
You
was
were
John
in.
Cameron. Yeah,
I never saw it, but I remember what a huge deal it was when it came out.
it's pretty good. Then there's 9 Songs, which came out at
I
like the
saw
same
that.
time. And then Antichrist. Well, I think that's one of them.
Ooh, Antichrist, a horror film? What?
Not Antichrist. I'm sorry, Nymphomaniac.
Oh,
Was
No,
it the
say,
Lars von Trier?
they're both Lars von Trier, but yeah, I think that Nymphomaniac has real sex in it. Regardless, obviously it's about sex, but yeah, and so those films were, John was very clear, John Cameron Mitchell, this is not pornography. Sex is
Yeah.
a part of life. And so just, I just want to show it. It's not designed to titillate. And my experience in watching it is that it's not titillating. It's sometimes funny, awkward. It just doesn't titillate. And so like pornography is very much in what it's doing. That's why I compared it with advertising. It's like very much like it's trying to elicit a reaction out of you. That's why we say like war porn or nature porn. I mean, it's just pressing one button in you.
A specific reaction, because the films are, a filmmaker or an artist is trying to elicit some kind of they're trying to evoke something, but they're not saying what it's, I mean, I argue that bad art, they do have a specific goal in mind. They want to evoke this particular emotion, or they want you to think this particular thing, but good art evokes, and it's not utilitarian in the purpose of this is what I want to evoke, like a porn channel. I want you to watch more porn and see more advertising. Like that's really the bottom line, versus an art that's kind of like, here's what this is coming from in here. How does that resonate with like what's they want? There's a seeking to resonate, but not for a specific end goal or kind of resonance, versus the porn is very, very specific.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying like Short Bus is the answer. It's not like, sexually, it's not the answer to what we're saying, but it does have a different presentation of all kinds of weird sex than being out to titillate. It's more intellectual. It's supposed to go into a different folder. And the one other thing I just want to say is that like shows like Bridgerton, like these like sappy, like more female oriented things, I find those to be gross and pornographic. That's just me.
I'm not familiar with that.
Pornographic? What do you mean?
It's so these are like things that have like very fake sex scenes.
Yeah.
And that's what I like more about Short Bus, is that it's not pressing that button. It's not trying to be sensual. It's not trying to turn you on. It's so manipulative.
It's just trying to be honest.
It's like, look at these characters and what they do in the story.
Yeah.
In the chat, there's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. Seven Serpents says, I would like to see porn outlawed 100%. It will always be destructive to the individual's psychology and society as a whole. And then that leads into, for me, the question back a few statements before. David Moore said, under what circumstances may children responsibly be exposed to visuals of nude adults? What of nude marble statues? And so that kind of, I think that those two comments kind of express that complexity of deciding what is porn. Even if you wanted to outlaw porn, where would you draw the line? Where could you decide, okay, this is sexually explicit in a way that is damaging, and we agree that we don't want this? And where is a visual depiction of sexuality, nudity, sex? What is okay? Where's the line?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting I tend to agree with the comment that porn should be outlawed, even though I cannot quite believe those words are coming out of my mouth, because it conflicts with what I believe. But and I would have no clue as to how to implement that. So I'm glad there's wiser people around that could decide that. But
right. I don't know about that.
Yes, let the big sky daddy or whatever decide. But I just think that there, I don't even know if it's a strong argument to be made for it, because I think there's stronger arguments to be made against it in a rational way. But in my gut, I'm like, that sounds about right to me. But the thing about, exposing children to nudity, like the phrasing of it is a little bit tricky, because like for a child, especially a young child, to see a naked person, even a naked adult, uh, I don't find that like that should not be programmed into that child as inherently sexual. I mean, maybe it's because I grew up in, like, spending a lot of time in France and Italy, and just like little kids in Italy don't wear bathing suits, and little girls don't wear top. They wear bottoms but not tops on the beach until they're ready for puberty. And I think that having a fairly relaxed look, that's just a human body, attitude when kids are little is fine. It's healthy. And yeah, and the statues and the arts. I mean, like, even the other day we watched that new Jennifer Lawrence movie where she's like a hard on down on her luck girl in Montauk, and she drives a taxi anyway. And there's a scene where she's completely naked, and I watched it with my son, and of course he was mortified, and I was like, what are you gonna do? It's just a human. That's what an adult human female looks like. And it was not a sexual situation. It was kind of like a slapstick situation. And I think there's a balance to be struck there, because at the same, while I also told him, do not watch porn, to whatever degree of success I might have had with that, I'm also like, yes, that's Jennifer Lawrence's naked body, and that's not a big deal. Um, I don't think it's, I don't, I also think that people have an internal shame compass, and they kind of internally know that you're not supposed to be naked, but having someone pass by on a screen that is naked, who's just walking on a beach or something, is not the end of the world. It's sort of like you're developing a sense of just a what it means to be a human being, and I'm okay with that. I also think, I mean, and here we are with the art. You walk into any museum, all the paintings from I'm showing I've never studied art history. Let's say the 18th century, there's so many, the Renaissance. That's what I'm thinking of. There's a lot of nudes in those paintings, and obviously that's not porn.
Yeah, yeah, I want my kids to be. That was a good point about the nude body to a child should not automatically elicit
Right,
sexualized. And so,
right.
what do you do about, like, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about, like, if the parent has shame around
Yes.
around their own nudity around the child, that could create some kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think shame is like, it's like a red flag. It's an internal warning system that is hijacked by abuse and becomes very toxic. But I think there is a form of shame that is like, it's almost like an allergic reaction. You're saying, no, okay, this is a line I don't want to cross. And I think in this overly permissive, liberal society, we've pretended that shame serves no function other than the negative function, the negative version of shame. Of course, I live in Ireland, and Ireland is like so burdened by shame, and it's very much that country which is, sexual repression and church repression, and women and men who are very private and kind of like tight, with their bodies, and it's also very cold and damp here, so no one's running around with their boobs out. Well, actually, they do now, because everyone dresses like that now. But that was the stereotype of Ireland, right? Is this sort of like punitive approach to the body. And it does do harm. It does. I mean, it makes people miserable. I've seen it in older generations. You don't really see it so much anymore. But you would definitely see it in older generations, of this real extreme reserve that was brittle, and obviously a shame inheritance. I mean, just so happens we've gone too far in the other direction now.
Well, I think
Like,
that was what the sexual revolution was railing. I like
right.
to think that was the intent, like, about against
Exactly.
that.
And
Uh,
Emilia, as you said about your father being the victim of abuse from the church, and then embodying the shame and perpetrating and carrying it with him, and then it passing on to you, that's like a fascinating dynamic. I would love to hear you talk about that more, because that to me is like, it really encapsulates almost everything that I spent a lot of time thinking about in terms of how these things are passed on generationally, and what kink really is, and it's not this benign thing, and or maybe it is, and it's very, very interesting. I mean, maybe want to get onto the art part of it. But yeah, that's, Emilia, everything you've said so far has been very interesting.
Oh, thanks. One thing I wanted to mention is there is a movie about what we've been talking about. It's called Don John, which is a play on Don Juan. And it's got the guy from Third Rock from the Sun, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and I want to say Julianne Moore and Scarlett Johansson. And that movie is about it's the same conversation we've been having. It's about a man who represents all our boys, and how does he find intimacy in this mess of boobs and butts and never ending smut. Like he actually wants intimacy. Like, and so so I don't know. I mean, I don't really know how, what I feel like, that just the statement that I made about my dad is like, it's just a thunk. It's like, wow, I just said that. Yeah. It's just a thunk. I don't know that it's just, and I think it's related to the deep throat thing also, when we know that our whole culture was changed via this movie, and we didn't know at the time that we were watching rape.
Right. And we were all the idea that everyone was getting off on this, and actually they were getting off on rape, on a woman.
And wasn't her story, I mean, can you fill this in for me, because I really don't know that much about it, but it seems like at the time she was saying this was great.
Yeah.
And then when she had time later to reflect on this and be honest about the scope of her life, she saw it very differently, and she was ready to talk about it differently. But this makes, it's interesting. Who do you believe in that? Do you believe her then, her now? And how do women change over time throughout their lifetime? Because we tell different stories to ourselves sometimes, and then we tell different stories to the world. And what is that based on?
I think she was in an abusive relationship with the filmmaker. So, I mean, I personally completely resonate with, that she would have projected whatever was expected of her in that role. I believe her. I believe her, and I feel like believing her now doesn't make her a liar then. We just see that she's being manipulated.
I think what happens with young women is that they become intoxicated. I mean, they are also manipulated, and there's all sorts of other things, but they all, young women, at least I feel like I was kind of like this, are kind of intoxicated with their own youth and their own beauty. And it's almost like it's a fun game to play. And because it's intoxicating and because it's exhilarating, you see how men react to you. You go there. And I mean, obviously, this woman really went there, like to an extreme degree, and she was actually very much abused, and it was recorded, and millions of people saw it. But even in just much more benign interactions, that's where young people's wildness comes from. And when I was young, I definitely had a streak of wildness in me, and now I'm a crotchety middle-aged lady, and I'm like, that's terrible. That is the natural course of life. I mean, I think that most people go through that, if not all, and obviously not all, but most. And it's not just the deep throat lady. Donna Summer did the same thing. The woman who did who was the Roe in Roe v. Wade, also then became a repentant and recanted and said, well, not recanted, but said she regretted it. She regretted her abortion as she converted to Christianity. Donna Summer converted, if I'm not mistaken, it was Donna Summer. I mean, people who live in Apollonia, I think, who was it with Prince? I think she did the same thing. People who live like exceptionally wild and debauched youth, where they've really, really transgressed in like at pagan levels. When they become older, they feel repentance for that. I think there is a spiritual price to be paid later in life to a greater or lesser degree. So someone like me, who had only a very mild case of wild streak, I don't feel the need to repent, but I look back on that and I look back on my own folly and the things I did that were unwise, and I feel grateful that I didn't have to pay a high price for them. Um, but I think that that's just a natural progression. I think men do it too, probably. Um, and for this one, these women, that's another thing about porn is these young women are involved in porn now because they don't have the same barriers. They don't have the same boundaries that you do, that you develop. You also develop your boundaries through having your boundaries transgressed and you having to fight back against that over time. It's like a muscle you develop over time. And when you're young, you're like, oh, it's okay. I mean, I think that's fine. Like when I was 19, I was a life model from the time I was 19 to when I was 22 or something, which meant I worked in an art school and I took my clothes off. I stood there naked for art students. And I did this in my entire 4 years of college. And the college got a call from these producers of porn. It was a magazine, and they would just pass these sort of freelance jobs onto models. And I considered it. I took a meeting with these guys. It was a man and a woman, and they had like fancy clothes, like suits, and we in a hotel lobby in Dublin. And I was kind of like, and I was a poor student, and I had a shaved head, and I looked, I was like a student in the '90s, a Gen X kid. And I considered it, and they were like, yeah, no, you should totally do it. And I remember thinking like, yeah, why not? Why not? I don't see, like, I'm a liberated woman. I should do this. Even though I also said to them, like, I don't think I'm the type you're looking for, like physically. I had like a shaved head and small boobs. I'm like, I don't think this is it. And I don't really remember. I think that they ended up not opening up this magazine that they were supposed to open up. But I did consider it. My point is that. And I was like I was a fairly sensible young lady in every other way. I was doing a good degree, blah, blah, blah. But you don't have the same internal brake system when you're 19, 20, 21 that you do when you're older. You develop that over time. I think that's kind of a natural thing that happens. And I'm very glad that that it didn't go any further than that, obviously.
I think that's such an interesting experience to draw from, and statement about the progression of our attitudes towards our own sexuality as we age. And I think that it's really interesting. And what you're saying, Emilia, about the woman who was in Deep Throat, and Jenny, your point about women's changing perspectives, the question, I guess, could it be said that, do all women who are acting in porn, is there some degree of coercion, or is some of this really healthy for them? And at what point do you draw that line? Where do you find that? Because it's a really common trajectory for someone to say, I love this, it's great, and defend it staunchly. And then later on in life say, I was an abused and manipulated poor girl, and I didn't deserve to be treated that way. And what I said then that's not true. That was based on my manipulation. And so at what point do you believe people, and is it just that we change, that as we age, our forms, the patterns that we occupy change, and can we be seen as a free agent at every point in the road, or not?
It's a hard question. One porn star comes to my mind named Aurora Snow. And there's different ones. Annie Sprinkle also comes to mind because she's a big feminist. I saw
Annie Sprinkle live in Northampton in 1992.
What was she doing?
She was had her legs spread and she had a speculum in, and you could line up and go look inside and see her cervix.
Wow.
Stuff like that. And like she had slideshows, like how she put
Wow
on her crotch and her dog licked it off, and she had sex with her.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Oh my God. That's so interesting that you say that, because I edited a book about which she put a chapter in. I've said too much already, but the book is about her chapter is about ecosexuality, which is her new thing. She's like, now her and her partner, I can't remember her partner's name, are out there in Santa Cruz being ecosexuals, which is like making love to the ocean. And I don't know, like when you get what?
I wonder if magic mushrooms are involved.
Yeah, like just having, like, embracing, like having this idea that like everything is sex, and so getting off on your interactions with nature, like I don't know, but then I wondered, like, did they just like forget to mention animals here? Because it seems like that answers the question that I had.
Yeah, she's been there, done that.
But Aurora Snow is she was an interesting porn star who um came on the scene in a pretty wild way and was immediately doing more extreme stuff than is usually recommended for a newcomer. And I don't know how many years she spent doing that, but then she transitioned to being a journalist. And so I think it's for Huffington Post or something, but she's got this whole public profile now where she's a journalist, and she has written about porn and safety around porn. So she's out there not doing porn anymore, but talking about when her boundaries were crossed. And like, I got into it. And her statements are, I was not abused. I did like this job. It was, but it could be better. It could be safer. And so it's like, can she be believed? Can she not be believed? Like, obviously that question still resonates, but I don't think that every woman is going to have the same experience. I think that it is a terribly difficult, I think it's a terribly difficult thing to keep safe, to regulate. I think it's nearly impossible, but at the same time, I think that banning it would produce a more dangerous environment because you can't.
Yeah, I get that argument. Yeah.
I don't know about this framing though, about with the Jenny, like that. I understand the gist of it. Like when women are younger, that's a big source of their power, or
Yeah.
they learn that they don't like tend to like. I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody, but like, when I was younger, like you learn kind of like you think, oh, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to achieve these things. But then you start, but in reality, in the world, on the street, you're learning that, wow, actually the biggest power I have is my body and how, and men's response to it. So you're kind of like, it's a little disorienting, and we
Yeah.
could go trans stuff, but it's disorienting. So I don't know that it's as simple though as like transitioning from that, and then you get older and you kind of, now you're on the other side of that power and you're like, oh, that was wrong. I think it's possible in the moment to feel both things, like a lot of
Yeah.
confusion. Mary Gateskill wrote an essay about this in Somebody with a Little Hammer. Like she's so good about nuance and complexity. And she wrote about Linda Lovelace, and she wrote about how, like, it's quite possible that it felt very, very good because of the
Yeah.
power and the attention, and also inside it felt bad too, and
Yeah.
any number of things, like, and also maybe she was a little roused, or maybe she in a masochistic way, or maybe she wasn't, like, it's
Yeah.
possible that all these things are happening at once, and and then you get older and you just, one thing becomes more true at that time than it was at that other time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
It's
confusing
very confusing,
for a
actually,
young
Jodi.
woman.
It
And
reminds me of a story I was told by a woman who I was my landlady when I lived in Dublin. Um, and I'm almost reluctant to say because I don't want it to sound like I'm in any way. This was her personal experience, and this is entirely her personal experience as the mother of um, children who were sexually abused by a neighbor. And she said this thing that stayed with me forever and ever and ever. And she said that possibly the most damaging thing, and it had been a bad situation, particularly bad. One of the most damaging things for her children was the fact that in the moment, while they were children and this was going on, there was part of them that enjoyed it
yeah.
because of the attention it brought them, and if there was things about it that felt good to them. And that was the kind of the psychologically breaking shame, because
Yeah.
because what you do is you're rendering your victim complicit.
Mhm.
That so in all of these sexual crimes, or sexual, not even crimes, but these really dubious sexual situations, the victim, which is in and of itself is a sort of a blunt term, is complicit.
Mhm.
And so like, and I think Linda Lovelace and the fact that that what you just said about the Mary Gaskell is exactly, it hits that nail on the head. And that's why, because of the nuance and because of the complexity, to me, we can never know the truth of what someone feels in one moment to another. We don't even know what we feel one moment to another. So it's pretty much impossible to project. So paradoxically, that's where I get my blanket ban. I know that sounds like it sounds like the opposite. You should be nuanced. It doesn't really matter. You can debate it all you want. You have to kind of buttress against it, because all of that nuance is entirely particular to the person, and I cannot foresee the ways in which my son will the nuance he will have when he's interacting with the world in general. If I mean, I can't even figure out my own mind half the time, or I can, but it's a process that you learn. So I think that's the key thing with porn and with sexual. I call it advanced sexual identities. Most people do not have, even if they grow into middle age, they never get comfortable with what I call euphemistically advanced sexual activities, which are kinks and all that stuff. Some people really are, and some people genuinely are. Some people are genuinely in the moment, but not later in life. And it's an infinite variety. You can't possibly account for all of it, which is why I think porn is so fiendish, actually, because it really does hijack our innermost private desires and kind of like magnifies them and like telegraphs them to the world. It's also why trans has been so successful, and this push to normalize kink is so successful, because we all carry within us something that we're slightly ashamed of, that we think is dirty or perverted or weird. And if you're
I think you're doing a good job of highlighting the fact that in chronically abusive relationships, there's often a high degree of emotional complexity. It's not so simply black and white to everybody who's involved with it at the time.
Yes.
That's why a lot of times you'd have to take some space from the relationship to really digest how wrong you now think your thinking was, how you see things differently after you get some space. It's abuse dynamics are very complicated.
Yeah.
Someone here in the chat, let's see, the finisher says, I have never known a single woman in sex work that wasn't from trauma. I think the finisher is saying sex work being something that you would do if you had some sort of trauma, maybe sexual or relational trauma in your life. And so that raises a question. Is even the person who feels like, the woman who feels like she's doing this out of her own agency and because she enjoys this, is there something in her? Is there something wrong? The fact that she is able to disconnect sex and take sex entirely into a transactional material plane and disconnect it from intimacy. Does that indicate what are your thoughts on that?
I don't agree with that statement. Well, it's very like experiential. Like, I have never known, so I can't disagree with that. But I don't think that that I don't look at it that way. But I think it's just not black and white. It's like most people. But if people are working through their trauma using this, I mean, are they not allowed to in a safe environment? A, and then B, I'm thinking, how is that, like, I'm sorry, I'm a reforming former, socialist minded person, but like, how is that different from the way that we exploit the workers' bodies in various other ways that can be extremely harmful? It's really the lack. It's like, not if a person actually does want to do it and can find a way to enjoy it, like, the thing is that I think that if we just as a society were more on top of coercive control, then we would just have such a better handle on all of these dynamics, workplace dynamics, interpersonal dynamics. The Linda Lovelace story, like, if she's in an abusive relationship, like, if you leave an abusive partner who essentially brainwashed you to like being their slave, essentially, an abusive relationship is like a mini cult, then you could say retroactively, when the person wakes up and realizes that they've been abused, that all the sex they had was rape. It's
Right.
If we don't understand, it seems to me that the prime aspect here is agency, and like boys should have agency over their sexuality, and they're being manipulated, and we all need to have agency over our sexuality. The answer is not to be scared of sexuality. It's to find the healthy, connective, intimate, like all the healthy stuff is like, leads us into the light. I mean, sexuality is not bad. It's a spectrum. It can be very.
Is it sacred, or is sex work just work? Is there something sacred about sex that makes it different from other forms of transactional labor?
Well, I think that
depends on the sex and the couple. It depends on what you're having sex for, right? Are you
but I think in the most kind of, yeah, I know what you mean. But I think in the most like unmolested, unprogrammed, in the most natural state, sex is a sacred act, and I think, but the idea that that you mentioned, Emilia, of it's exploiting a body just like a worker's body is exploited. That argument is in a material. If you are a materialist, that's kind of a bulletproof and obvious argument. But the problem is we're not solely material creatures. And as we were talking about in the beginning, the kind of the bonding mechanisms and that aspect of sex, to me, is we're creatures with souls, and sex does not live in the body, it lives in the soul. I mean, I'm speaking metaphorically, but that is where, because sex is how we propagate the species. We propagate the species and we have sex because it feels good, yes, but because there is a love element. Maybe not so much anymore. Now that we're all hoes, but like that is the ideal, right? We have sex when we love, because we love, and then we propagate the species. So it's this fusion of biology and spirituality. And I don't mean that like, oh my God, spiritual sex, like, oh my God, tantra, whatever. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But like, it really is much more pedestrian and mundane than that. That's how our bodies are set up. So I find the materialist approach, whilst I would have agreed with it a long time ago, or it makes sense when it's hermetically sealed, I find it actually leads to like ghastly places, like children, like young children or teenagers mutilating their bodies, and actually even worse things, if such a thing is possible. I think that's the entire point. Now, just a segue, because I know we want to talk about art a bit. I think about where conservatives get it wrong, because even though I'm much more partial to conservatives now than I ever used to be, and I think I agree with them on a lot of stuff, they also get it wrong because they fail to account for the kind of flawed nature of people, and they focus too much on the sacred and the spiritual and the soul, and they forget about how we are flawed bodies and sacks of meat. And it's almost like they're like, the materialists are, to me, like scary, and really they go to some really dark places. But then these sort of like innocent conservatives, I really find them innocent. They lack the knowledge of what human behavior truly is like, and it's deviant and it's weird and it's messed up, and it always has been. I mean, porn now is bad and it's new-ish because of the video and the online and all that is new. But every other deviant freak, like every deviant freak behavior has been with us forever. These are not deviant freaks, are not new. They've always been around. And conservatives idolize the past and say, "Oh, well, look at this! Like we used to have such great culture, and all the deviant freaks that we didn't. Those are a new thing." That's not true at all. I don't know. I kind of just like took us in a totally random direction there. But
to go back to the question you originally asked me to talk more about my dad, it's like, I guess my point is that what is manifested here is my dad's abuse. The shadow of my dad's abuse lingers. And that's, to me, the lesson is that we're looking at this problem, and I think we're looking at a lot of opportunity to deal with abuse. like that's what I just see with it's like like a a wound that you're in your mouth that you just keep going back to. Like, people are working a wound. Like, my wound happens to be inherited from my dad. It was a really bad wound. I mean, I don't know how, if it goes back further than that. And it's not just his, it's like all of this institutional abuse, which again brings up to me the trans issue, because that to me is institutional abuse. I just think that we need to me, it just all looks like an opportunity to deal with abuse. So I was in Short Bus, as I said. I didn't have sex in the movie. I could have. They said on one day of shooting, if you come back on such and such a day, you'll get paid, a little bit more money. And we're having like an orgy scene. You could go from being an extra to being a sextra. And voyeurism is participation. So I wouldn't even necessarily have to do anything, but I was free to. And I thought, and I totally would have, except for one thing, which is that somebody very close to me had been sexually trafficked, and I was helping her get on her feet. And I knew that I couldn't explain the difference between, me with my agency, like doing this fun, whatever thing, and the fact that I wanted her to stay safe. And so just sort of like that abuse thing keeps coming up, right? And I also, so I, no regrets that I didn't do that. And so it was a protective instinct towards this younger female and what she'd been through, and like how confusing it is, that led me to say, well, on her behalf, I'm just not going to show up. So
was that because you knew she had been exploited, and you knew that was wrong, and you didn't know if you had the right to exploit yourself? What was that? Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think it would have been more just, that I was a role model. I was a role model to this person, and they had obviously crossed some wild lines, really bad lines. Mm-hmm. And at that time, this was before we were even, I think, on top of using the language of sex trafficked girls. So you'd call them a teen prostitute, as if they could consent. Yeah. And this was complete slavery. And she didn't know it, because it's also brainwashing. It's also a cult, the game. It's so, yeah, I mean, as far as what my reasoning was, I don't know that I know. I think fundamentally I knew that I couldn't explain it to her, and I didn't want to try.
It was just really good instincts.
I didn't want to. I knew I didn't know how I could explain the difference to her, and I didn't want to try, and so I just chose because I mean, also, my experience in life has been so extreme. Raised with no sexual boundaries. I then dabbled in being an Orthodox Jew as a response. Like, we're always trying to find the moderate, healthy place, and so I had access to that, like, switch that I'm not an out of control deviant. Like, I might think like, oh, that might be fun, but then I have a brain, and I'm like, okay, no.
Right.
And isn't that what we want? We want people to.
Exactly right. And I think I've said this before, that we all have that. We all have an internal moral compass. And for some people get it completely destroyed, either via social pressure or like abuse in the home or in the school as young people. But even those people, even people who go through these horrible experiences, still we are born with an internal moral compass. We don't actually. I mean, obviously learning it from society is very important. Learning from your family is very important. Learning from your culture is very important. But even people who don't have the benefit of that will find their line. They're like, no, that's not right. That feels weird. That feels bad. I don't like that. Something in your brain will tell you to stop. And I really think that's it's like a biological reality. It's not me making that up.
It's but moral, though. A moral.
It is moral, but I don't think there's my personal opinion, based on
Active.
zero science, is that they're the same thing.
Oh, well, maybe. I don't
Maybe.
know. Well, listen, I wanted to say something about Amelia though, like what you said about the wound in your mouth and like you keep picking at it or you keep going to it. I do think that your kinks or like things that are especially arousing, that's a rich source of information.
Yeah.
Because I was reading somewhere somebody said this, and I believe this to be true, that there is the things that arouse you the most, there's something about them that originates from some kind of wound. And like just being like, oh, that's bad, I'm not going to go there. Like I actually just wrote a song about this. It's called Eros in E minor or something like that. Um,
So
but
everything that arouses you the most comes from a wound,
I
or
don't know. I didn't say everything.
okay, okay.
I think I would say often.
Mhm.
This is just my speculation. I just think that where there's a sexual energy and like being aroused, like there's power in there's power in the shadow stuff,
Yeah.
like the stuff that you feel the taboo or the shame around. Like why? Like why is it that like I'm secretly being aroused by that, even though intellectually like I'm very against that, you know, like
Yeah.
there's something in there. Or like even like you could look at like male and female roles, like the female fantasy of wanting to be raped, or and the male fantasy of like dominating or raping, like to play that, like that's more maybe more of a cultural thing, but like there's some information in there that goes pretty deep and maybe beyond words, but I think it can happen on an individual level as well. And I think maybe it does. And I'm not saying like the exact scenario is like, oh, that happened to me. I just more like it's more psychological. Like for some reason, that thing that like especially evokes that sexual energy or that arousal and the kind of shame stuff, there's something about the dynamics of it that are involve some kind of wound. At least
Mhm.
that's the theory that I read by this writer, and it really resonated with me.
Mhm.
And so I don't know that like just shutting it off, like I think exploring it, I mean that's basically you're going into your shadow and you're like trying to get some information, you're trying to become conscious.
Mhm.
So I don't know what the way is for working that out, or like that doing sex work is working that out. I don't know, but I just think that, I mean, I think personally like stuff that I have like a big block or like, oh, I don't want to go there, don't want to go there. I'm like, there's probably something there.
Mhm.
And as
So
a society, when we're all fixating on these same wounds, I feel like it seems a little simpler. Like we don't have to actually think about it, like is the porn star working it out in a healthy way? Like we can just get that information, like we, here's the narrative here. There's a societal thing that's
yeah, there's something happening. There's like energy and power around this. So what does it mean? Like, yeah, I mean, so people who like analyze popular culture, I mean, there's a lot of shit in those zombie movies, right? Like
Mhm.
COVID hit and the lockdowns and mandates, and I'm like, oh, that's or not just that, like just the like the brain, the massive cultural gaslighting or brainwashing, like somewhere in us, like we fear other, and like the prepping and like people are gonna getting the guns together. I'm not saying that's not true or necessary. People shouldn't do that, but I'm saying this like there's like a cultural fear of other humans like gonna take our stuff. Like there's a tightening up. Like people are
Mhm.
understanding. Oh shit, there's like a tightening happening.
Mhm.
So that was a very simplistic way of talking about zombie movies, but like even American Idol, like when that came out and that was like huge, like that was the first of many, many, many shows like that. And somebody asked me, why do you think these shows are so popular? And I'm like, the first thing I can think of is like, because there's hardly any pure heroes like we want a fucking hero who fucking did it and it's pure. Like it's very, very hard. It's like just music, and then there's the art thing again. Like it's pure, unlike like Gandhi today it wouldn't even exist because people would immediately find shit out about him and like he'd be totally discredited. Like he probably wouldn't have become this cultural hero or icon. Like so like it just feels like there's a lot of power in what our culture focuses on, and like look at Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Like
That black and white thinking. It's that black and white thinking and that intolerance for nuance, the purity requirement. That's so fascinating because anybody, as soon as you're a human being, you're not pure.
Right.
As soon as
Yeah,
you've lived a life.
but we need we need those things. These are
Archetypes.
like archetypes, exactly. So Trump is like the jester. I would argue he's the jester, and people are both appalled and like drawn to him based on that kind of archetype. It's not like this yeah. I think there's a lot of archetypal stuff going on, and there's a lot of information there on a cultural level, but also bringing it back to sex on a personal level.
Well, I think one of the things that you said early on, Jodi, I feel like I've said the same thing. Porn is a psyop. Porn is the way it's being used right now, whether it's intentional or whether it's emergent. It's really an attack on intimacy and an attack on people's ability to bond with others. It's an attack on men through women, and it's an attack on women through men, and it's an attack on the self. And so I think that there's real reason to be concerned about it. We haven't really gone deep into porn versus art because this conversation ended up going in all kinds of other different directions, which were fascinating. So we might have to retitle this this live stream.
It's just that like what is porn versus what is art are like important questions.
They
and
are.
like no one can answer the question of what is art.
What we should do. Yeah, well, we talked about what is porn. Maybe we should do another one on what is art.
What is art?
Yeah.
I read something real simple about it, which was that art can be about sex, but porn is sex.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. There's a lot to go into, I guess.
Ooh, I have a good quote for you. That
Okay.
Maybe you guys have heard this. Everything is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power.
Who said that?
I don't know, but I thought it was a woman, I think.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk about Germaine Greer too.
Well,
She's
we should.
really misunderstood. James Lindsay posted something by her, and I was like, he totally
Is it something you want to say real quick, or should we devote like real time to it?
But she was talking about her being a radical feminist and how she created all this, like, it had to do with the trans stuff. And I was like, oh, no, honey, you do not know Germaine Greer, like the woman who was talking about like wanting to have sexual intercourse with a man, like actual intercourse, and like because quote, who wants to orgasm around a void? Or Camille Paglia, we've talked about her too. Under my thumb, and that song Under My Thumb, like all the feminists are so mad, and she's like, but it's a fucking masterpiece.
I know. I love her so much. Actually, I quite like Germaine Greer as well. I just like really crotchety women.
Because you are well on your way, Jenny.
I know. I just love, like absolute ball busters. I just like, oh yeah, I like that.
Julie Burchill.
Well, just to the finisher in the chat, yeah, please email me. You can find me through my website. I think it's theradicalcenterconsulting.com. So go ahead and send me an email if you want. And you guys, this has been really great. Emilia, sorry. It was really nice to have a chance to speak with you again. It's been a while, and it was really great to hear your thoughts and your experiences and how they, there's a lot. All of us are coming from different places in this, and yet we're all sort of in the same age range and with mothers of sons and just living in this culture where we are right now. So it's fascinating to hear the slightly different and sometimes wildly different perspectives that we have on this. And I'll let y'all, does anybody have a final thought that you didn't get out during this that you want to cap off with?
Not really, but when you just said that, I was like, yeah, we're like The View.
Oh God, we're like I was just thinking we're the non-woke, which allows us to actually analyze everything instead of just like there's all these like places you're not supposed to go or talk about and do all this fake shit. I would say check out Emilia's music, Nehedar.com.
Well,
awesome. Yeah, everybody say your websites again or Twitters.
Oh, I'm going to start because I should have announced myself as a musician. The whole Smith thing's been an identity crisis for me. JodiShaw.com.
And I'm JennyEHolland.substack.
Yeah, I'm nehedar.com and EHEDAR.com. And thank you so much for having me, Lindsay. This has been so cool.
Yeah. Well, it's really nice to see y'all, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks to everybody who joined us in the chat.